I don't know whether you have picked up on that story of two astronauts, I think, who at the beginning of the summer took off on one of Boeing's Starliner spacecrafts with the intention of being at the space station, the International Space Station, for a week. Something went wrong, and they're not getting back now until February. Can you imagine that? Going to space thinking that you're going there for a week, and 9 months later, you return. Now, one of the guys who's stuck up there right now is a Baptist elder. His name is Barry Wilmore. He belongs to Providence Baptist Church in Pasadena, Texas. And the fact that he is stuck on the space station for what is now another 5 months, 6 months, isn't preventing him from doing his job as a Baptist elder, because two members of his congregation, a guy called Billy, who has just gone into hospital, and a lady called Suda, who's just turned 93, got a phone call from Barry this week. Isn't that pretty cool? You answer the phone, and it's the International Space Station calling. I just love that. I love that picture. The church is a family that cares. For me, that's the message of 1 Timothy 5. We're on this journey through 1 Timothy. We've reached chapter 5, and 1 Timothy, quite challenging in the early chapters, really getting down to the nitty-gritty now, where the Apostle Paul is actually beginning to address some really challenging pastoral issues that this church in the city of Ephesus is experiencing. So let's read 1 Timothy 5. We're going to read verses 1 to 16 together, and then we're going to think about what it means to be a caring church. Now, as we read this passage together, you'll have a hard copy Bible in the seat in front of you. It'll appear on the screens as well. As we read this together, you're going to hear Paul speak very directly to a particular pastoral situation in this church. As you read it, you may think to yourself, not sure this applies to me. If that's the case, don't dial out yet. I hope we're going to see how it does apply to us here at Willowfield in the 21st century. So here's 1 Timothy 5, and I'm reading from verse 1. Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, in all purity. Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness in their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even when she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So what does it mean for a church family to care? What does it mean for us here at Willowfield, the Willowfield church family? What does it mean for us to care? I want to offer you 2 or 3 thoughts this morning from this passage from 1 Tim 5. A caring family, a caring church family values the vulnerable. is not naive and cherishes the reputation of Jesus. So a caring family, a caring church family, values the vulnerable. Barry Wilmore, that space or that astronaut who finds himself stuck on the International Space Station, who's a Baptist elder, someone said of him, "That's Barry," referring back to the 2 phone calls that he had made. "He looks for those who are down and out." He looks for those who are down and out. That was his reputation. Yes, he was a NASA astronaut, but that was his reputation. He looks for the down and out. The church that cares values the vulnerable. Here is the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy 5. Here's the Apostle Paul. He's the great evangelist. He's the great church planter. He's the apostle who took the good news to Rome and with intention to take it all the way to Spain. Here's the great apostle who wrote the letter to the Romans, that great treatise on justification by faith, a great explanation of the gospel. Here is the Apostle Paul writing in detail about how to care for widows, how to care for the vulnerable. Paul takes time out to advise a local church on how to care for the vulnerable. And that's the guts of verses 3 to 16. Now, it feels probably dated to us, and it's very, very easy then to dismiss it. But let's not miss the point that the champion of the gospel is the one who writes in detail to help the church care for the vulnerable. In Paul's day, widows were of significant concern for the church. If you were a woman married and your husband died in Paul's day, the death of your husband literally meant destitution. There was no social service. If your family weren't interested, you were on your own, unable to work, unable to earn, and unable to feed yourself. And so being a widow was probably one of the most vulnerable experiences anybody could have. In the church, there would have been women who, because they had come to faith, were rejected by their husband, perhaps rejected by their wider family, and would have found themselves almost experiencing the reality of what it meant to be a widow. They themselves would have been exceptionally vulnerable. And from what we know from church history, and not just church history written by the church, but for those who observed the church stepped up, and the church stepped in to that very vulnerable experience. A church family that cares values the vulnerable. Now, the vulnerable are not always easy to care for. It can be inconvenient to offer care to someone who's vulnerable. Their needs can be complex. And it's very interesting in verses 8 and 16 that Paul actually calls out relatives who are failing to care for their own loved ones, the widows within their wider family circle. Paul's not afraid, he's not behind the wall in challenging family members who are not looking after those who are vulnerable within their own families, despite the fact that it's inconvenient, despite the fact that it's complex, despite the fact that they probably are busy people with busy lives. Paul reminds them of their responsibilities. So here in this passage, we have a picture being painted by Paul of a church that cares and who values the vulnerable. Forgive me if I'm slightly controversial this morning. This is something which is quite close to my heart. Last week, the assisted dying bill came to Parliament. It's that bill that would see assisted dying or assisted suicide or euthanasia, as it is, that is often called, being entered into law in the United Kingdom. I would strongly encourage you to contact your MP. Mine's Gavin Robinson. Gavin's going to be getting a letter this week from me on this. I want to be encouraging him to resist this bill. And there are many, many really good reasons why I would want him to resist this legislation. And one of them is that this bill, the Bill of Assisted Dying, will make people who are already vulnerable even more vulnerable. See, down through the ages, the church has always responded to vulnerability with practical care. I celebrate the work of Dame Cecily Saunders and the work of the hospice movement. Prime example of how a person's dignity and comfort can be more than maintained even in the face of terrible illness. That's what we need to be championing. That, for me, is the DNA of the church. Dame Cecily Saunders herself was a remarkable Christian, and her work in palliative care was inspired by her own Christian faith. A church that cares values the vulnerable. A church that cares isn't naive. That's the second thing I think Paul is wanting to say to this church family. The church family that cares is not naive. And so, having a look at verses 1 and 2, if you've got your Bibles open, do look down. I'm going to read it for you. Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, in all purity. N.T. Wright, the great Anglican scholar, writing about 1 Timothy 5, says that lurking between the lines of 1 Timothy 5 are three great dangers that Paul is not necessarily naming, but he's most definitely hinting at. It's the three great dangers of power, sex, and money. The misuse of power, when God's boundaries of sex are crossed, and the mishandling of money. These three challenges are present in any organization, not just the church. But the church is vulnerable too. And Paul in this letter, and if you read between the lines, I think it is clearly there, Paul is saying, don't be naive when it comes to the issues of power, sex, and money. Don't be naive. Certainly in verse 1, there is a clear recognition that there are power dynamics going on within the work of a church family. He asks the question, or at least the question is implied, how does a younger man, in this case Timothy, exercise his authority as a pastor with older men and women? And Paul recognizes that there is the potential of a misuse of power in the church. In verse 1, there's a clear acknowledgement of sexuality in the church family. How does a younger man relate to a younger woman? And then there's that little phrase at the end of verse 2, in all purity. Paul's telling us, don't be naive. And then later on, as Paul addresses the issues of widows directly, there's a clear need to discern who needs support and who doesn't, who deserves support and who doesn't. And there's that implication that that support is going to involve financial support. So we have the potential misuse of power, a failure to prioritize purity, and the potential to mishandle money. And Paul just simply wants to say to us, guys, just don't be naive. There will be power dynamics in any organization. Even the best church will have power dynamics. Don't be naive. The fact that the church has men and women in abundance means that we mustn't be naive. Don't be silly. Be aware, eyes wide open. A church is a place where money needs to be handled and handled well. Paul is saying, don't be naive. But there is a fine line to be walked here, isn't there? A fine line between not being naive and yet being open to caring for those in need. I love the story that Paul Scanlon tells. Paul Scanlon was pastor of Abundant Life Church in Bradford. It was a church that worked in a very tough part of Bradford. It's a church that grew rapidly, and it positioned itself deliberately to reach the most vulnerable and the most broken. And he would say this, and I've never forgotten hearing him say this. He would say this: when he began to notice that people were leaving handbags and rucksacks on their seats, he knew that they were no longer meeting the people of their community. Now think about that. Don't be naive, but have an open heart. Don't be naive, but have an open heart. A church that cares values the vulnerable. A church that cares is not naive. And finally, as we come into land, a church that cares is conscious, so conscious of the reputation of Jesus. A church that cares is conscious of Jesus' reputation. Did you notice Paul's concern for Jesus and the message of Jesus is repeated a number of times in these first 16 verses. In verse 7, in verse 8, and then verses 11 to 14. So in verses 7 and 8, Paul is concerned about those relatives who are not looking after the vulnerable in their family. And his question is, what about the reputation of Jesus? What does that say about Jesus? And then the concern about a particular group of young widows in verses 11 and 14. His concern is he doesn't want to give the adversary any occasion for slander. You see, in all of this, Jesus is Paul's priority, the reputation of Jesus. Paul wants nothing to get in the way of the church, the gospel, Jesus, and the community that's been reached. You may remember right at the very beginning, I said the key melody line through 1 Timothy was this: keep the main thing the main thing. Keep Jesus at the center. Keep the gospel at the center. Keep the main thing the main thing. And here, as Paul is dealing with the nitty-gritty of a pastoral concern, he just brings that idea back again. And he says, in all that you do, these are my words, be mindful of the reputation of Jesus. One of the things that I love when I came here, one of the things that I love that I experienced here was the fact that Christmas, about a week before Christmas, quite a number of you head out to the streets to our neighbours in the streets closest to Willowfield, and you ring the doorbell. We do it on a Sunday morning and Sunday afternoon. You ring the doorbell. Here's a box of chocolates. And why do we do it? We do it because we're conscious that we bung up the roads when we come and park to come to church services. And we're conscious of the impact that has upon our neighbours. We want to be a good neighbour. You see, it's not just a box of chocolates. Actually, what we are doing is seeking to protect the reputation of Jesus. And that's really, really, really important. A church family that cares for the vulnerable. A family that cares is not naive. A church family that cares is conscious of the reputation of Jesus. Church family life is, for a large majority of the time, about the nitty-gritty. It's about learning to care for each other and do so in a way that honors the Lord, that's not naive, and that seeks to glorify and magnify his reputation. Why don't we pray together?